brought some other stuff in front of it. And the first one is, 2 years ago I talked about Thomas Noakes, who was a ne'er-do-well pretty much in Corpus Christi in the 1850s and 60s. But he was educated and talented and could do anything. He just, Corpus Christi was a tough place to live. But he painted this painting of the Battle of Corpus Christi Pass. This is essentially Packery Channel today. And in 1862, December of 1862, this ship, the Corpus, was attempting to get out the pass. And they ran into, first of all, out here in the Gulf, you can see up there, is a ship, a Yankee ship, and it sent these two small boats in to capture the Confederate ship. The Confederates had, as seamen, sharpshooters from Seguin, and they beached their boat and climbed up in the dunes and started shooting at the Yankees, and ended up killing 4 of them. The last one actually having gotten over across the water to the north side to Mustang Island, and one of the sharpshooters with a lucky shot shot him from across the pass, and he eventually died of his wounds. So we were really excited because this picture is owned, the original is owned by Charles Butt, that is the major owner of HEB. And so when we did the notes book,
Let's do that.
are you doing that or am I?
No, I don't know why it's doing that.
Anyway, so when we did the notes book, I knew about this painting and I contacted Charles Butt's archivist and said, I know he's got this thing, it used to be in his house on Ocean Drive because I've seen it. And she searched her archives and eventually found it and sent us a scan of this picture. So now we go, about a year later, hit your page down button, and I'm searching auctions on the internet, and one of the things I searched is Corpus Christi. And I found a painting of the Battle of Corpus Christi by D.R. Gamble. And as I went on back, I found a battle, this one, the boat fight in Corpus Christi Channel. It is another painting at the same time of the same battle by a different artist. And Noakes and Gamble were in a contest, essentially, not a contest, but they were both trying to sell their paintings. And Gamble had been more successful in selling the 1919s, the Battle of Corpus Christi, the downtown battle picture, because I know there's at least 3 and maybe 4 of that painting in existence. As far as I know, there's only one of the Noakes. So he had sold 3 or 4 of them. So this time when he did the Battle of Corpus Christi Pass, he had a print made. This black border and the 2 boxes in the corners is a print. And in the middle of that print, he has hand-painted, watercolored in the Battle of Corpus Christi Pass. So you're seeing 2 versions of the same battle by 2 different guys dating back to 1862. And I'm lucky enough to own that one. And so here you have a different view. You still have the Confederates up there in the dunes shooting, but it features more of the Yankees down here, and you can see one is dead, and you've got oarsmen rowing and so forth, so the Confederate ship is still there, and it's still got the Union or the Confederate flag up there, and you still have the Yankee ship in the distance. So I thought I shared the first one with this audience 2 years ago before COVID, and so I thought I would share this one with this group also. And then usually, so that's all we're going to do about those. You can go to the next slide. The next slide, usually when I come, if I've got some new pictures of Port Aransas, I bring them. And I was given an archive, I think, of 18 photographs of deep sea fishing from 1955 to 1974 in Port A that belonged to one guy. And so I'm going to share a few of those photographs. This one is the beginning of this deep sea roundup. And the deep sea roundup was started in 1932 as the Tarpon Rodeo. So at the Tarpon Rodeo, everybody started from Port A and went out at the same time. And I believe this also happened for the first few years of the deep sea roundup, because these are definitely not tarpon boats. These are deep sea fishing boats that are heading out for the beginning of the tournament. Next slide, please. So here, this is the guy who owned all these, a guy named Evans, T. Frank Evans. That the first picture in my archive is there's two of them from 1955 in Mexico, big deep sea fish, big fish that he caught. So I didn't bother to show those, but I'm going to show some of the ones. This is back in the old days when you had the deep sea roundup. Today they catch and release, so you don't get to see the fish. Back in the old days, they came in and showed them all off. So this is the first one. It's the first marlin of 1967, and that's T. Frank Evans right there. He's very recognizable by his crew cut, and he's in some of these pictures. Next one. There's another one. I don't think that's him, but there's and I'm not all that good on pictures. What kind of fish is that? Anybody know? Is that a marlin? Okay. There's another one. Keep on going. This will go through these fairly slow. There's another one. Port A boatman back in those days.
Yeah, that's Lloyd Ryer holding the tail. A very famous captain around here for quite a few years.
The guy holding it is identified, and it's one of the Han guys. So he was.
That's got to be Lloyd Ryer. Anybody else?
So?
That's Lloyd Ryer, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Keep going. There's Mr. Evans again. And, they had a big crowd. Everybody would get around. I think he could pose with other people's fish too. There's one of them that I didn't throw in there of Evans with a nice trophy though. So he did one once or twice. Keep going. There's a beauty. They're still hanging that. I just put about 8 of them in here. One more. And some of them they would put on their sign. This one says, I can't read it, but it has what the boat was, who the captain was, or the catcher was, and the weight and the length. Next one. Oh, somebody caught a nice tarpon.
Yeah, great.
Isn't that a beauty? So I think that's that. Is that correct? Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So now we're going to talk about Zachary Taylor. And that's obviously not Zachary Taylor, it's Murphy Gibbons. Many of you will recognize that picture. He was an asset to Corpus Christi from 1981 until he died just about a year ago. And wrote almost all the books I have published, all but one, he has written. And he and I worked together and did 14 books. And this is his last one. He died of lung cancer. And so his last year, he worked on a couple of books that he thought that he wanted to do. And the last one he finished was Zachary Taylor. And he had done a Zachary Taylor book about 15 years ago that was smaller and was just on Corpus Christi. And he said to me, "What did you think of my book?" And I thought, this was years ago. He said, "What did you think of my book on Zachary Taylor?" I said, "Well, I thought you could have done more." He said, "I thought so too." And so he tackled that as his last project was to do another Zachary Taylor book. So let's go to the next page. So that's the book. And it's got a picture on the front of the U.S. Army on North Beach. This little stream right here is Hall's Bayview. And today that is where the ship channel is. So as you go across the high bridge, you're going across that little stream. And so the Army was on North Beach and then down about 4 or 5 blocks to where, essentially where Artesian Park is today. And that picture was drawn by Daniel P. Whiting, and we did, years ago, we did his book. Whiting had left an autobiography, and it had eventually got into Corpus Christi. The library had got it transcribed, and then Murphy tackled it and footnoted it so you would know what he was talking about. And when we published our second book, which was Corpus Christi History, Murphy said, I got another one that's all done, but we never got around to publishing it. You want to do that one too? So we did that. That was Daniel P. White. And it's a really interesting book, not all that much on Corpus Christi, but it's a lot about the Mexican War, and then the rest of his career, before and after. He was in Seminole Wars in Florida, and then he was stationed at various posts around the country, around the West, and ended up going out and fighting. Supposedly the Mormons were going to rebel and start their own country, and the U.S. Army went out and had a show of force, and he was among those guys. So Whiting drew that picture in 1845. It's the earliest known image of Corpus Christi. And of course, the city of Corpus Christi is way down here on this end, which is where the Corpus Christi Yacht Club is today, if you know where that is. And that was deep water. There's a stream that's still there that runs from Blucher Park down through downtown and out beside the yacht club. And that stream had scoured a slightly deeper area so they could get ships closer to shore. So that's where the city was. So that's the cover of the book. Corpus Christi to the Rio Grande, 1845 to 1846. So he quits when he mentions that they go across to the Matamoros, but it's all really about South Texas. Well, there's Zachary Taylor, as he usually appeared, except Zachary Taylor was known for riding side saddle, not astride, and he hardly ever wore a military uniform. He preferred to dress like an old farmer. In fact, one day he was sitting outside his tent, sharpening his sword, and a young officer who didn't know who Zachary Taylor was came by and said, well, hello, old chap. Would you be willing to do how much would you charge to do my sword? And the old chap said, $1. So when he came back with it a little while later, he was appalled to see all the officers around and find that was Zachary Taylor that he was calling old chap. He was in disguise. So Taylor was an interesting guy. He didn't necessarily follow all the dictates of modern, at that time, warfare, but he was really good at improvisation, and he never lost a battle, and actually won against superior force. Every battle he fought was against far superior forces. Let's go to the next page. So we come in, you've probably all seen that before. That's the Aransas Pass around, somewhere around those days. But there's a lighthouse there, so it was later. Here's the lighthouse. I like this picture. Actually, this is from the 1890s, but it was before they started doing a lot of the work. The lighthouse is up here. It's about a mile from the pass. And that was built in the 1850s, and the pass was finally steadied with they were able to put a breakwater along here and keep the pass from moving in the early 1900s. So from 1855 or so to 1900, the pass had moved from being up here to down here. It was averaging about 200 feet a year. So it moved a full mile. And this area, Turtle Cove, was virtually impossible to get through. The water was 2 to 3 feet deep. So in order to get to Corpus Christi, you went up north of Harbor Island and came back down, and the west side, and eventually they put in this Morris and Cummings cut in the 1870s that was 8 feet deep. And so you still go up towards Rockport and then come down the backside of Harbor Island. And the geography of the passes is, you're getting a lot more than just Zachary Taylor. But the geography of the passes is each bay along the coast has one pass. And so water only goes out one place. And this Aransas Pass is the exit point for Aransas Bay. So all the water from Aransas Bay would go out there. And Corpus Christi Bay's exit point is Corpus Christi Pass or Thackeray Channel down the other end. And those passes all migrated south as because of the currents in the Gulf. The currents went around counterclockwise and moved the sand downward. So each year the passes moved south as the currents dumped more sand on the north side and took more sand away on the south side. And that would continue until a hurricane came along. And a hurricane might reopen the pass up north, and it would store it all over again. But you can see how far the water had to come from Aransas Pass all the way up on the other side of Harbor Island. It had to come down through here. And you can see here there was probably a pass was up here one time and up there further and so forth. So the geography of the passes is really interesting. And that pass would silt up. Every day would be a different path through it and different depths and so forth. Let's go to the next one. So anyway, so they landed on St. Joseph's Island. And they didn't know what they were going to do after that. But they figured out pretty quickly that the place to be was Corpus Christi. They did send a party up to Rockport to see that, but that was actually too far away. And Corpus Christi was actually in disputed territory. The Mexican border had always been the Nueces River, and when Zachary Taylor, when Sam Houston defeated Mexico, the treaty of that he got Santa Anna to sign said that the border was the Rio Grande. And so that area between the Rio Grande and the Nueces was disputed territory, controlled by neither country, and also hardly settled by anybody. The only English settlement in it was Corpus Christi. And that was a settlement of about 100 people, and they were all in the business of smuggling goods into Mexico. But when they landed on St. Joseph's Island, there were 2 or 3 families living there. And they showed the army that if you dig down into the sand, you'll come to water, and the top couple inches of that water will have fresh water on it. So if you dig a hole and put a barrel in it, the barrel will keep the sand from falling back in and refilling the hole, and you can dip out fresh water out of the top layer of that water. So they told the Army that. And it turns out that was also true of North Beach. So the U.S. Army actually got their water, most of their fresh water, from sand wells on North Beach while they were camped there. Let's go to the next slide. So anyway, they didn't stay on St. Joseph's Island long. Instead, they came to Corpus Christi, and that's pretty much what Corpus Christi looked like. This is a blow-up of one of the, there were 2 pictures done of Corpus Christi. One was Whiting's, and one was another guy that we don't know who he was, but it was in a newspaper. And this is the town of Corpus Christi. And you can see maybe about a dozen buildings at most with stockades around them to protect from Indians. And that's what the U.S. Army, almost 4,000 troops came to. Didn't look like that very long because the city ended up having 2,000 people in it. And it's described as whores, gamblers, traders, and all the worst people in Texas. Next page. So this is again a view of, this is the full view rather than just a cover of the Whiting print of what the city looked like. So you can see there was virtually nothing. They had plenty of room. They camped along the beach, so they had plenty of room on the backside to drill and practice their artillery and so forth. And they spent almost 6 months in Corpus Christi, from August to March, of 1846. And so they actually learned to be an army, because prior to this, the last time that many 3,000 or 4,000 men were together in the army was the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, the U.S. Army had dispersed, usually just a company, to camps throughout the West to try to protect the frontier. So you had camps along the Canadian border, camps along the West, and then some camps along the coast. And there was no big army anywhere in the U.S. They had like 7,000 men in the army, but they weren't together. So they came down here, and all of a sudden you had 3,000 to 4,000 men. You had over 200 West Point officers who had been through the rigors of going to West Point, and they all became a united unit. And when they started fighting, they knew they could rely on each other and so forth. Next. So that's a close-up of the camp. They were living in little tents, which was not too bad during the summer, but it was a really crummy winter. There were 2 or 3 northers. Temperature got down to 22 degrees. We had a freeze up where the edges of the bay and so forth froze, and killed all the fish. So there was redfish and trout coming up to the edge of the bay. So the soldiers all ate fish for a while, and it was quite an interesting time. When they first came, they thought Corpus Christi was paradise. And after a winter here, they thought it was hell, because those tents weren't much good against the north wind. But it did get them all united. And also, when they first came, North Beach was covered in brush this high. So there was rattlesnakes all over the place. And Napoleon Tecumseh Jackson Dana, what a name. Napoleon Jackson Tecumseh Dana, who was an officer, woke up one morning with a rattlesnake curled around his body. However, the head was outside the tent, so he was able to get away. And one slave who belonged to one of the officers was killed when lightning hit one of the tent poles and electrocuted him during one of the electric storms. So it was an interesting time. Let's go to the next one. So here's where they were. The dark road is Highway 181. This is the Harbor Bridge right here. So as you're coming down, as you're heading towards Corpus Christi, you come along 181, and then it makes a big curve to go over the bridge. So they started where that curve sort of ends. There's a company here, 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 and here. 7 companies of men. And Artesian Park is right in here. And I-37. So here's the I-37 entrance. So they were camped. The last camp was just to the north of the I-37 start, where the big courthouse is today. Let's go to the next page. And you can see the big flag. Let's go back. Page up. The big flag is Zachary Taylor's headquarters. So he made sure he had plenty of guys in front of him. So if the Mexicans would attack, he was behind. Now you can go to the next one. So then after nothing happened, and he was here to start a war, and the war wasn't starting. So they had to march down the valley, and they took a route. They went west to the Mott's, or Nueces town, which is essentially where the bridge across the Nueces is today. I-37 bridge that goes north. They went west to there, and then they headed south to pretty much to the King Ranch area, and then down. And essentially, their route became Highway 77. But it was also the route that the Mexican troops would come up. That was decent ground. There was some water along the way, but it went right through the middle of the Wild Horse Desert. And while they were out here running around, marching down, the U.S. Grant, some of the other officers, rode their horses out to see this gigantic herd of horses that Grant figured was the size of the state of Rhode Island, of just horses. And so anyway, and the hunting, when they first landed, the soldiers would fish by they'd catch a crab, put it on a hook, wade out to as far as they could do it, throw it in a gut, and then wait for a redfish to take it. When a redfish would take it, they'd throw it over their shoulder and run back to land and haul that redfish back to land. And it could be a redfish as long as 4 or 5 feet. Back in those days, nobody was catching it. So it was a hunting and fishing paradise. One group of them took a trip up to San Antonio to pick up the U.S. mail and the payroll, and so about 20 U.S. officers went along for fun, and they were never out of sight of the deer that whole trip. And the deer were just out of arrow range from them. So, let's go to the next page. I think we're going to get to Fort Brown, a rectangular fort with 6 parapets on it, made out of dirt. They dug down in the center and dug out bomb-proof so that people could be underground in case they were shot at. And then they also dug a moat 20 feet wide around the outside of it, and used that dirt. They piled that dirt up into walls that were 12 feet high and 15 foot wide of dirt. So it was a dirt fort. And you can see it was right across the river, very close from Matamoros. And the Mexicans had actually set a battery right next to the fort. And off they went. Next page. So when the fort was 99% done, Zachary Taylor heard that the Mexicans were going to go and attack his supply line at Port Isabel, or what is Port Isabel today. So he took several thousand of the troops and headed east to Port Isabel, got some supplies, got some cannons, some of his bigger cannons, and came back. And on May 8th, they ran into the Mexican army at the Battle of Palo Alto. And it was essentially a artillery battle from about 3 o'clock in the afternoon until dark. The U.S. Army was victorious. The Mexicans lost about 4 men to every man that was killed or wounded on the U.S. side. And then that night, the U.S. Army actually slept on the battlefield. They did not give any ground up. And when they woke up the next morning, the Mexican army was gone. And what they had done is they had retreated to a better defensive position, and they camped out in the Resaca de la Palma. Want to hit that one? Which was a resaca, a dried up resaca of, it was a branch of the Rio Grande that had been bypassed. And they were lined up a mile across, and were waiting for the U.S. Army to come along. And again, Zachary Taylor did the wrong thing, according to traditional battle formation. Instead of striking along the entire line, he ordered his men to go at one place, which was where the artillery was of the Mexicans. They got off one shot. In those days, in order to reload a Mexican cannon, it took 3 minutes to reload a cannon. So they made one volley with the cannons, and in that 3 minutes while they were trying to reload, the U.S. Army was on top of them with bayonets. And they took the Mexican artillery, so they no longer had any defense, and then just poured over the line and started killing the Mexican soldiers with bayonets and rifles and so forth. And that was the end of those 2 battles. Is there any more on here? Is that it?
Let me see.
Yeah, so there's another picture of Zachary Taylor. In uniform. Then go to U.S. Grant. U.S. Grant without a beard. He was young, 26 years old, 5'8", weighed in 120, so he wasn't a very big guy. And he was deemed to be pretty. So the U.S. officers in Corpus Christi decided that they would do plays and to entertain each other, and they built a 700-seat theater in Corpus Christi that the Army, the officers and the locals and the enlisted men could go to the plays and probably pay a dime to see a play. So they decided that they were going to do the Moor of Venice. And U.S. Grant, because of his size and the fact that he was not real masculine at the time, he was chosen to play Desdemona. And Theodoric Fuller, who was another lieutenant, was chosen to be the lead, and he could not look at U.S. Grant without laughing. So they gave up and imported a actress from New Orleans to play Desdemona. So U.S. Grant never got to play Desdemona. But soon after that, he started growing his beard.
I bet.
Next, is that it? Oh, so what's left? Well, there's several things left. This was not here, but in Artesian Park in downtown Corpus Christi, this monument still sits there. And it's a monument to Zachary Taylor's army being in Corpus Christi and camping on that site, although it's close to that site. And today, that is the 0-mile marker. So when you're driving from I-37 or from Port Aransas, it says 15 miles to Corpus Christi. It's 15 miles to that stone. Most cities in the country, the mile marker is to the local post office, but in Corpus Christi, it's to that zone. So that's there. And I don't think I have pictures of.
When was that erected?
It probably says on there, but it was probably the 40s. Yeah. So the other thing that's here is that there are, in the back of the book, there's the list of all the men that died in Corpus Christi. It's like 180 or something. And they are all buried in unmarked graves in Old Bayview Cemetery uptown in Corpus Christi. So if you're up on uptown Corpus Christi on Caronco, which goes to the north, and you cross the highway, right on the other side of there is a cemetery. It's called Old Bayview. It's the first U.S. military cemetery in Texas, and it was founded when 8 men were killed by a steamboat explosion by the steamboat Dayton, and boat exploded as it was coming across the bay and killed 8 men, and they chose this burial spot, which when it was chosen was just gorgeous. It's this hill overlooking both bays, and of course now it overlooks buildings and the baseball stadium and so forth. But it was a really pretty place, and so that's where all those men are buried. So there's a list in the back of the book of all the men that were killed here in Corpus Christi or died here in Corpus Christi. The biggest loss of life in the Mexican War was not war, it was disease. More men died of disease, cholera, yellow fever, and all that kind of stuff than died of the battle. So Christmas is no longer coming, but Valentine's Day is. So let's go to the next slide. That's the book, Zachary Taylor's Army in Texas. It sells for $44.95 plus tax. I'm selling them for $45 even, so I don't have to mess with anything. I'll pay the tax, so you get about an 8% discount. Next page. Okay, for the 2019 Centennial of the battle, or of the 1919 storm, I had about 500 of these printed. I got 200 of them left, so I got a special sale. They're half price at $20 a piece. And so if anybody would like to have them, I've got some of them with me also. It's a great book on lots of photographs of the storm damage. There's about a page and a half or 2 pages of what people went through up here in Port Aransas, going through the highest dune, and waiting the storm out, only to go back and find everything gone. I guess that building survived, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And 2 or 3 others. They didn't survive in the same place, they were moved, but they survived. And so it's a really interesting book. That was our first book. And, we had so much fun doing that. And
It really changed the trajectory of Port Aransas, that storm.
And then here's some of the more books. I will point out 100 Tales of Old Texas. I brought 8 or 9 of those. 100 Tales was Murphy's second last project. And as he was fighting his cancer, he was reading a bunch of old books and choosing short stories out of each one that would be of general interest to everybody. And he collected them, so there's 100 tales, mostly anywhere from 1 to 7 pages, but the average is 400 pages, so the average is 3.5 pages long. And they were all out of copyright, so they were done before 1960, so they're old books you don't find at Barnes & Noble or Amazon. And so he put those stories into a book in chronological order. And it's a really great set of stories of Texas history. Covers the whole state, a little bit more heavily weighted towards the south end of the Texas. But it's really a good book, and that was another one of his projects. The book he did not write is Water Woes, which is a history of the water department of Corpus Christi. And it was written by the water engineer who he and his father had 98 years of service in the Corpus Christi Water Department. And our water department is really fascinating. We've had dam breaks, and the first time they put a pipeline in, they were pumping water directly from the Nueces River, and they were pumping salt water and using it to irrigate. So that didn't last very long. They put a temporary dam in of sandbags, and it washed out about 4 or 5 times. So they finally put a real dam in. And that's the dam as you go. If you're out on I-37 and you keep on going towards Kingsville, and you see the dam on the right-hand side. That's the dam they built to keep the salt water from being blown up the Nueces River and into our water supply. And it's only been breached twice: 1919 hurricane and Hurricane Cydia. Water went over that thing, but there's so much water went in on the other side from rain that it flushed it all out within an hour or 2. So it was never a problem. Keep going. Is there any more books up there? Yeah, there's most of the rest of them. So I brought them all. I brought 2 or 3 of all of them. I brought more of 100 Tales. I brought a lot of Zachary Taylor and a lot of the 1919 storms. So if anybody's interested in the book, I'll be happy to take cash, checks, or credit cards. And I'll take questions. Anybody have anything? And I can talk about other stuff other than just Zachary Taylor, and because I've read all these books 3 or 4 times, and stories just pop out. That's better? Yeah. Okay.
Questions?
Yes, sir.
In some of the books I read about U.S. Grant, he was here, and so was Robert E. Lee. Well, okay, then the books I've read...
Robert E. Lee was not here.
He wasn't?
No.
As a captain?
He was captain, but he wasn't here. Robert E. Lee was first sent to San Antonio or Austin, and he eventually joined Scott when he came down, when he took most of U.S. Grant's, or most of Zachary Taylor's officers and men, and took them south into Mexico. But Robert E. Lee was never in Corpus Christi.
In Corpus, he was on the other side of the Rio Grande.
Right.
Right.
But he definitely was a major player in the Mexican War. I'm listening to a book right now that I recommend highly, called Training Ground. And it's a book written by a guy who studied the war, and he wrote about the major players in the Mexican War, or the players in the Mexican War that became major players in the Civil War. And Grant and Sherman and Jackson and Robert E. Lee are some of the major ones that he talks about. Meade is another, and he tells what the war was going on and what their role in it was. And Grant was one of those guys that he would study everything. So he was not only fighting, but he was watching what they were doing and learning the experiences of fighting a war and how to fight a war from the guys who knew how to do it. And it's really fascinating. Of course, Robert E. Lee was the engineer who found the way around the pass that the Mexicans had blocked, and found the way across the lava field at Mexico City so that they could attack Mexico City. He was tremendously important in Mexico also. Anybody else? Well, thank you.
Well, I've got a question. Today, about what is the present location of the Fort Sims that was here at Fort Ranges? About where is it at relative to the present topography?
One of you Port A guys know where Fort Sims is?
Well, it wasn't a ship channel,
Oh, is that where it is?
but you want to answer it? Now it's probably not.
Go ahead.
Well, it ended up in the ship channel after the war, because I think there was some type of incident with a ship hitting some of the wreckage and trying to find somebody to sue because of the damage it had done to
So
the
the
ship.
pass was still moving, and
Yeah.
it moved right over the fort.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I don't know if is there some remnants on St. Joe's, or once it sinks down in, if it just gets buried.
The pass really was stopped in 1885.
Okay,
And so that's quite a bit after the Civil War.
right.
And so we would assume that Mercer's house, because he moved over here to be a pilot, and Fort Sims and everything else, are pretty much sitting in the middle of the ship channel, or where the ship channel would be, because all that was further north.
Yeah.
The tip of Mustang was further north, and that just kept going.
So a lot of the stuff that was on Port A in the Civil War is now underwater or under St. Joseph's Island sand, because it just kept on moving, as we talked about, 200 feet a year.
That's why the jetties were so important, to stop that movement.
Yeah. If you don't stop that movement, you don't know where the pass is every day.
That's right. Yep. And that's why the pilots were so important. That's why you couldn't really have a town on the north end of this island to stop that erosion southward.
So was the Tarpon Inn, which was called the Seaside Hotel before it changed its name, was that built after 1885? It was, wasn't it?
Yeah, Stevenson built it 1888, something like that.
Okay. Because it was originally known as the Seaside Hotel, and then in 1902, I think, it changed its name to the Tarpon Club Annex. Because the Tarpon Club was across the bay on St. Joseph's Island, and it was very popular and well known, so they changed their name to Tarpon Club Annex. And then when the Tarpon Club died, I guess they became the Tarpon Inn.
We have a history mafia around here that just gets all tingly with facts like this. And you could go in the museum and learn stuff that is really, really cool about, you get post-hole into so much of our history here that's really fascinating. Jim, why don't you talk about why are they here in 1845? And the reason is, and you might want to speak to it, we were a country in 1836, and we became part of the state of the United States of America. And Zachary Taylor and the U.S. government and all the money that it took them would never have come down here unless we had become a state.
Right. Texas was a republic. It had applied to become a state in 1836 or 1837, right after it had gotten free. And because of the slavery issue, they did not want another slave state, would have outnumbered the free states. So that was put off. And finally, by 1844, it became an issue. Texas applied again to become a state. The U.S. and James K. Polk and John Tyler. John Tyler. No, not Tyler. Who was it? Anyway, the president decided that they wanted to bring Texas into the Union. They they had another free state, so they would have equal things. So Mexico said that if Texas became a state, it would be declared an act of war. So they sent the U.S. Army to, first of all, to Louisiana, and then when it became apparent that we were going to become a state, they sent them to Texas. And Corpus Christi was chosen to be here, be the place where they came. So in February of 1846, when the official statehood happened, the U.S. Army was in Corpus Christi, protecting our interests. And it was originally called the Army of Observation. And then it became the Army of Occupation. And then they wanted the Mexicans to start the war. There was a lot of people in the United States that were against war with Mexico. So the only way that that would be palatable was if they were able to provoke the Mexicans into war. And the book goes into that a little bit too, about provocations, and the Mexicans finally attacked a company of soldiers that was out on a scout and killed 10 of them and captured the rest. And that was the bingo. And so they sent the missive off to Washington, war is declared, and the next thing you know, we're fighting at Brownsville. The interesting thing in the Whiting book, Daniel P. Whiting was inside the fort. He was being bombarded during the during the bombardment of, where is that? It's a little blue. Right there. He was inside the fort. So he writes his memoirs, and he includes quite a bit of information on that fort. One of the things the Mexicans had a problem with, they did not have a lot of iron. So they made their cannonballs out of copper. Now, the problem with copper cannonballs is an iron cannonball, when it explodes, if it's got munition inside it, it sends shrapnel all over the place. Well, they discovered that copper cannonballs, if they exploded, it exploded straight north, straight up. So if a cannonball came, they didn't worry about it unless it was right under you. And so only the Mexicans shot something like 3,000 cannonballs into the fort in a series of 4 or 5 days. And 2 people were killed. One was hit directly, twice. It hit him, killed him. They had him sitting over on a litter. Another one came along and took his head off. So he was doubly dead. And the other person that was killed was Major Jacob Brown, the commanding officer of the fort. And he was hit in the leg, and they had to amputate his leg. But he died about 4 days later from disease, infection, and so forth, because they did not know about sterilizing wounds or anything like that. So those were the only 2 men out of like 200, 300 in this fort that were killed with all those cannonballs. And so Whiting writes quite a bit about that bombardment in this book. And we have his painting on the front. And that was Whiting. And he was a U.S. West Point graduate also, 1830s. And so his career was really interesting, his career, because back in those days, you went to some place for a year, you got a year off. You got to go home, foster another child, father another child, go visit the family, wherever the family was, and then off for another year. And then as the kids grew, he was able to take some of them, and I think eventually all of them, to a camp in Oklahoma, for example. And so it was just really interesting how times change. And of course, to get home, it might take 3 months. You'd take transportation, and eventually you'd get to a train or a ship. If you were down south, you'd go up the Mississippi to Ohio or Pennsylvania, and then take a train to wherever you were going. Whiting was from New York State, so he would go back there. It was fascinating stuff. And Whiting's wife her mother died in childbirth. And so she was 17 years old, and she took that infant that had lived and raised it as her own. As a 17-year-old girl, Whitey met her like 2 years later. They married, and that little baby came and grew up with them. She died giving birth to her 8th child, his wife did. So he had 8 kids that he had to do something with, all of them under 12, including an infant. And so, that's part of the story. It's just really a fascinating look at life in a different era than what you face. I mean, we think that COVID is bad. Childbirth was bad. So anyway, all these books are just full of good stuff. Yes, sir?
How about further West Texas? What was happening in West Texas at this time?
There was no West Texas at this time. Corpus Christi was West Texas in 1845. If you look at a map and look at where everything is, it's all east of us, pretty much. Gonzales was as far west as it went, pretty much. So yeah, Corpus Christi was on the frontier. There was no West Texas. The Comanches kept everybody out of West Texas until during the Civil War. The Comanches actually moved the border about 20 miles back by attacking the settlements. And it wasn't until the 1870s when the U.S. Army finally killed the buffalo and took on the Comanches full time that West Texas actually became settleable.
The border was still the river.
Border was the river. Well, the border was the river, but it went all the way up to Santa Fe. So Santa Fe was considered part of Texas. And then it's a stovepipe map, so it went all the way up to like the 42nd parallel, Wyoming border or something. So, and then the Compromise of 1850, when Texas became a state, the Republic still had like $14 million of debt, which in those days was a lot of money. They had no way to raise it. So the Compromise of 1850, the U.S. government actually adopted the borders that we know today as the state of Texas. And they took the rest of the land for the $14 million, and they paid off the $14 million in debts. So if we had had $14 million, we'd be skiing in Texas today.
Here's a map that shows.
Yeah, there is Corpus Press has a map they call Ski Texas, and it has a map of the Republic with all the different ski resorts of it today. Actually, they've got 2 of them. It's quite fun. If none of you have ever seen Coconut Bay Press, go to their website. They have published nearly 100 books on Texas history, and maps and photographs, especially oil photographs and so forth. Fascinating stuff. And they also sell things like I'm the 5th generation Texas cups and stuff like that. So they have really neat stuff. Coconut Bay Press, they're located in Corpus Christi, and good people. I've worked with them since in fact, I bought the first book that they ever sold. I was their first customer. So I now have the first book of every edition that they've sold. And anyway, it's fun. And then we published together, I wrote an introduction to a book called A Man from Corpus Christi, which is one of the funniest books you'll ever read in your life. It's about a man from Corpus Christi who was a hunter, hunted birds, and professionally. And a Yankee doctor from Rhode Island came down and spent 9 months with him going out, and they were back in 1880s, if you were a birder, you didn't go look at the birds, you went and shot the birds, skinned them, and took the carcass, the feathers and so forth, back and displayed that or put it in a museum or so forth. And so that's what they were doing. And all over, they went as far up as Columbus, Texas today, as far east as the Brazos River. And this is their adventures. And it is one of the funniest books you'll ever read in your life. And I recommend that highly. It's called A Man from Corpus Christi. Who was the guy? So that's about it. Anybody want a book? I have them all here, and I will be happy to sell them to you. And again, Valentine's Day is coming.
So Jim, thanks again for coming and regaling us with these great stories of a lot of military stuff that I'd never heard before. So it's pretty, I really enjoyed it. And next week is Carter Brown talking about not only the chapel, but the history of the Carter family and the Badger family. And it's kind of it's a little enhanced from the one he did about 2-3 years ago, if you got a chance to catch it. If you didn't, it's definitely worth hearing from. And if you haven't had a chance to sign in or make a little donation, there's still time on your way to talk to Jim about his books. But thank you all for coming on this cool rainy night, and have a safe trip back home.